Greetings, this is Greg. The 1964 model year has to be one of my favorites because a lot happened in the automotive world. One of the biggest things was the introduction of the Pontiac G.T.O, which started the 60s muscle car era. Of course, there's room for debate on just what was the first muscle car and even on the definition of the term muscle car. We'll cover all that in time. First, we have to go back to 1955. In the mid-50s, the major U.S. auto manufacturers built what we can call mid-size cars. I'm going to use the 1955 and 1956 Chevy Bel Air for reference here, but both Ford and Chrysler Corporation had similar models and similar stories. The 55 Bel Air was a popular car with its 115-inch wheelbase and overall length of about 196 inches. The car was a nice size, plenty of room for a typical American family to ride in comfort, but not too big, and it had some decent performance options. Well, it wasn't long before the concept of lower, longer, wider sort of took over in Detroit, especially among the big three auto manufacturers, and soon the Bel Air grew, and it grew a lot. By 1959, it had gone from the 115-inch wheelbase up to 119, and overall length went up by over 15 inches. In short, the Bel Air had gone from being mid-size to full-size. By the early 60s, General Motors, and quick side note, for those of you who don't know, in the 60s, General Motors had several U.S. car divisions. It's different than it is now. These divisions included Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac. But anyway, by the early 60s, General Motors divisions had smaller compact cars like the Corvair and senior compacts, a little bit bigger, like the 62 F-85, and full-size cars like the Bel Air, but nothing in the middle. In 1964 that changed, and GM introduced their new line of mid-size cars, which were now called intermediates. They wanted to take back the part of the market they had abandoned, and they wanted these new intermediate cars to have some performance to attract more buyers. Chevrolet brought the new Chevelle to the party. Initially, there were 4 engine options, the top version being a 283 cubic inch version of Chevy's classic small block V8, putting out 220 horsepower. They offered more powerful engines later in the model year, and I'll cover those later in this video. The Chevelle rode on GM's new A-body platform, which was one of the best 60s American car chassis. All the other GM car divisions used the A-body chassis, with the exception of Cadillac. Next up, Pontiac brought the Tempest, also running on the A-body chassis. Pontiac had been getting pretty serious about performance, and the Tempest was offered with a 280 horsepower, 326 cubic inch V8. If combined with a 4-speed manual, that was a pretty hot car. Oldsmobile brought the new F-85 Cutlass, also on the A-body chassis, with the top engine being a 260 horse, 330 cubic inch engine. Buick also had a car running on the A-body chassis, which was the new 1964 Skylark, the top engine being a 300 cubic inch version of Buick's famous nailhead V8. It was an older design, and the top version had 250 horsepower, and that was with 11-to-1 compression, the highest of the cars discussed so far. The Buick 300 cubic inch nailhead was a great engine, but it didn't breathe all that well and was quite limited in power potential. So that 250 horse variant, that was about all they were going to get out of that particular engine. Notice that all of these new A-bodies, of all of them, the largest engine is in the Oldsmobile, and it displaces 330 cubic inches. Oldsmobile had larger engines that would fit into the chassis, and so did the other divisions. But General Motors had a policy limiting these cars to engines with a maximum of 330 cubic inches. It's interesting to note that at this point, the Chevelle was offered with the 283 and not the 327. This was likely an internal decision at Chevrolet to avoid taking sales from the other models within the division. But over at Pontiac, a few guys decided to simply break the 330 cubic inch engine. This was pretty easy to do because the 326 used in the Tempest was simply a small bore version of the company's 389 cubic inch V8. Thus, swapping in a 389 was child's play. However, they went farther. They didn't just swap in a 389. They swapped in a 389 with 10.75 to 1 compression, that's quite a bit, a 4-barrel carb dual exhaust, and dressed up the engine with chrome valve covers and a chrome air cleaner. In this form, it put out 325 horsepower. But they didn't stop there. They knew, probably from lessons learned watching Oldsmobile with the Jetfire, I have a whole video on that, but anyway, they knew that to have legitimate performance credentials, the car would have to feature relatively good handling. So they put in stiffer suspension springs and stiffer anti-sway bars, just to make sure it would perform in the real world and on the racetrack. They also improved the brakes and the cooling system. Thus, they did a lot more than simply give the car more power. They named the new car the G.T.O. Technically, in 1964, G.T.O. is an option package on the Pontiac Tempest. However, later it would become its own model, and nobody really calls the 64 G.T.O. a 64 Tempest G.T.O., so in practical terms, I kind of consider the G.T.O. its own model even at this point. The G.T.O. option, let's say, also had various options in 1964. For example, you could opt for a triple 2-barrel carburetor setup instead of the single 4-barrel. This would increase horsepower to 348 at a slight expense in torque. There were multiple transmission and rear axle ratio options, and these had a huge effect on performance. More about that later. We need to take a side tour for a few moments and talk about horsepower in the muscle car era. As I said, the 64 GTO had either 325 or 348 horsepower. But what type of horsepower is that? Is that the same as 325 horsepower in a modern car? The answer is no. It is a totally different type of rating. In the 1960s, American cars were rated in SAE gross horsepower. This means that the engines were rated on an engine dynamometer without the full exhaust system and without the normal power robbing accessories that would be present when the engine was installed in an actual car. This means no alternator, thus no electrical load, no exhaust aft of the manifolds, and sometimes they substituted headers for the manifolds, no fan, and often no water pump and no air cleaner. In 1972, there was a big shift over to the SAE net rating system, and SAE net ratings are done with the accessories connected, and that results in lower numbers. There is no standard conversion factor, and as the engine specifications were changing a lot between 71 and 72, it's tough to find an apples-to-apples engine to compare between those 2 years. But a reasonable example is the Buick 455. The low compression version was rated at 315 gross horsepower in 1971 and 255 net in 1972, with very little change in actual physical specifications of the engine. Plymouth was nice enough to include both ratings in a 1971 brochure. As you can see, the numbers not only vary quite a bit, the relationship between gross and net is not consistent, even within this one brand. Take a look at the 2-barrel 383 versus the 340 to see what I mean. In this series, we're going to stick with SAE gross since every 60s muscle car was rated that way. But keep in mind, those numbers are high compared with modern cars. And of course, it can't be just quite that simple. There are cases where the horsepower ratings were intentionally low, usually something to do with minimizing insurance rates. And I'll mention those cases as they come up. Today, the only people still using SAE gross on new engines are various machine shops with engine dynos. They can't be expected to find and connect all the accessories, so they just don't, and they use SAE gross. Back to the GTO. It was a huge success. Pontiac's sales manager predicted that about 5,000 GTOs would sell in '64. Actual GTO sales for that year were 32,450. And every auto manufacturer took notice. In retrospect, it kind of makes sense. The GTO did it all. It was comfortable, worked well as a family car, young people liked it, it was stylish, and it would outperform European or American cars that were far more expensive. Thus, the muscle car era had begun. Well, just what is a muscle car anyway? We're going to have to define it. Now seems like a good time. Definitions change over time, and the term muscle car is often misunderstood. Furthermore, the earliest use I can find of the term muscle car is from 1967. It wasn't common until the 70s. During the 60s, these cars were most often referred to as supercars. There have always been powerful cars which could be described as muscular, almost as long as cars have been around. You could certainly buy a muscular car in 1963. In fact, there were a lot of them. For example, in 63, you could buy this Chevy and option it with a 409 engine with various performance upgrades, dual quads, and so forth. You could get it with a 4-speed transmission, positive traction rear end. In terms of quarter-mile times, this would be competitive with almost any 60s muscle car. You could buy a Pontiac Grand Prix with a Tri-Power 421, also a fast car. We could go back year by year all the way to automotive infancy. This Cord had a 300 cubic inch engine in 1929 and was very powerful by standards of the day. For purposes of this series, I'm going with the strict definition of the term from musclecarclub.com, which you can read here. I find that as soon as I stray from this definition even a little bit, it widens the field tremendously so that almost any car, if optioned a certain way, would be considered a muscle car, and that would make it impossible to have a video series with any real focus. An example of how quickly things would stray, or how easily I should say, in this case, let's take a look at the 64 Buick Riviera. It checks almost all the boxes for the strict definition of a muscle car. It's about equal to an intermediate in size. It has a 401 cubic inch engine as standard, and the 425 was a common option. It has a muscle car-like suspension and brake setup, very good all-around performance. I would say it's a muscle car in every way but one. The Riviera was expensive. Then we have the Ford Mustang, which also showed up in 1964 along with the Plymouth Barracuda. You know, the Barracuda actually showed up first. A lot of people don't know that. Anyway, both had performance options, but I wouldn't want to argue that either one was really a muscle car in 1964. They were pony cars, which is kind of a subset of muscle cars. Eventually, the line between pony cars and muscle cars blurs quite a bit, and we'll be talking about that in a later episode, specifically when we get into the 1967 cars. Another confusing factor is that muscle cars were really just versions of regular cars. For example, here is a 1968 Dodge Charger. This is not a muscle car. It's just a regular 68 Dodge Charger. Probably has a 318 two-barrel with no horsepower, no anti-sway bars, and lousy brakes. This one, which looks quite similar, is a muscle car. This one is a 68 Charger RT, and there is a big difference. We'll get to the specifics when we cover Chargers, but for now know that muscle cars had not only upgraded engines, but suspensions, some styling changes, and usually improved brakes and heavy-duty cooling systems and other components. For now, in 1964, there's only one absolutely true muscle car, and it's the G.T.O. But the other GM divisions, as well as Ford and Chrysler, did have stuff to fire back with. So let's go back to that Chevelle for a moment and see how they handled the arrival of the G.T.O. Remember, originally the Chevelle was offered with only two V8 engines, or well, it had only two V8 engine offerings. It had 6 cylinders as well. But anyhow, it was offered with a 195 horse 283 and a higher compression 4-barrel carbed 283 with 220 horsepower. I think those engines were chosen as part of an effort to minimize in-house competition. By that I mean I think they held back the hotter engines for the more upscale cars like the Corvette and Impala. Not to mention, there could have been concerns at the corporate level that the entry-level Chevelle should have a little less power than the more upscale A-bodies at the other divisions, like the Buick Skylark. Whatever the case, Chevy now had to meet the challenge of the G.T.O., and they had to do it pretty quickly, and the easiest solution was to put in a more powerful version of the small block V8 they were already using. So they put in the 327 V8 right out of the Corvette and offered it in 3 versions. The low-level 327 had relatively high 10.5 to 1 compression, a 4-barrel carb dual exhaust, and 250 horsepower. Next up was a 300 horsepower 327, most of the extra power coming from a different camshaft and a bigger 4-barrel carburetor. Now, in some sales literature, it shows that there was a 365 horsepower 327 option for the Chevelle. This engine had an even hotter cam with solid lifters, 11-to-1 compression, an aluminum intake manifold, and a Holley carburetor. It was essentially a factory race motor. It was somewhat common in Corvettes. However, there is some question about whether any 64 Chevelles were actually built with this engine, and if they were built in incredibly small numbers. So the engine that counts here for the Chevelle is the 300 horsepower version. This engine didn't give it quite GTO performance, but it was close and for less money. We'll get into the performance numbers later in this video. Next up, we have the response from Oldsmobile. They brought out the Olds 442, which was a more serious effort than we saw over at Chevrolet. Olds didn't just put in a more powerful engine, they created an entire muscle car package. If there's a second muscle car in 1964, it's the Olds 442. Olds had performance parts on the shelves from their police car program, and they made use of them. Unlike the previous year's performance car, the Jetfire, this time Olds uprated the suspension, and they really went all out. The 442 was the only muscle car of the 60s with a rear anti-roll bar standard. It might be the only one that has a rear anti-roll bar, period. And the 442 is one of the best handling muscle cars, better than a lot of European cars. In 1964, the 442 name means 4-barrel carb, 4-speed transmission. It also has a floor shifter, and dual exhaust. The car had various 442 emblems to distinguish it from the lesser versions of the car. Over at Buick, they didn't really react to the G.T.O. Buick was an upscale car, slotted in just below Cadillac, so I think they figured that if a performance-oriented customer showed up, they would just sell them a Riviera. This idea was not without merit. The 64 Riviera could be had with the 425 Super Wildcat engine, featuring dual quads, a hot cam, 360 horsepower. It would easily outrun an automatic transmission Pontiac G.T.O. I should point out that all of the GM intermediate chassis muscle cars prior to the 67s, shown right here, when equipped with automatics, had 2-speed transmissions. So all the 64, 65, 66 GM muscle cars, if they had automatics, they were 2 speeds. That handicapped them quite a lot, and for that reason, if you're comparing automatic versus automatic, the Riviera with its 3-speed just had a big advantage against a 2-speed GTO. Now let's look over at Ford for a moment. Ford brought back the intermediate in 1962 with the Fairlane, so in that respect they were ahead of the game. In 1964, it could be optioned with a 271 horsepower 289, and if it was set up with the right transmission and gearing, could be reasonably quick, but it's certainly not a muscle car. There was the ultra-rare Ford Thunderbolt version of the Fairlane, but that was really a factory drag car, not a street car. Ford's focus on performance at this point was primarily on the Falcon and the Mustang, which was based on the Falcon. In fact, the Mustang really is a Falcon with a different body on it, much the way the Barracuda is really a Valiant. But anyway, both the Falcon and Mustang did pretty well on racetracks. The Falcon actually took second place in the 1964 Monte Carlo rally, which is a really big deal. Neither car was really a muscle car, but they did have legitimate performance. In any case, we're going to move on. Meanwhile, over at Chrysler, they were getting off to kind of a slow start, and in my opinion, sort of missed an easy opportunity. They had a great small car with the Valiant, and a darn good big car, but no true intermediate. However, they did have the Plymouth Savoy. I'm going to call it the Savoy in this video, but the same car was also sold as the Fury, Belvedere, and Sport Fury. Anyway, Savoy was a full-size car, but it was kind of a smaller full-size car. Compared with the G.T.O., it was only 8.5 inches longer, and its wheelbase was only 1 inch longer, and most importantly, the weights of the two cars were very close, largely due to the Savoy's unit body construction. The weights of cars from the 60s are a little tough to pin down. They vary a lot with options. But a typically optioned G.T.O would weigh about 3,500 pounds. A typically optioned Savoy with a big block and a 4-speed only weighed 3,600 pounds, only 100 pounds more. Let's talk about those big block engines that Plymouth had for the Savoy. There was a 330 horsepower high compression 383 and a 365 horsepower high compression 426. Had Plymouth simply created an option package with the engine and transmission that they were already putting in anyway, and combined it with some anti-sway bars, metallic brake lines, could have come up with a catchy name and emblems, and they would have had a very serious G.T.O competitor. Of course, the Savoy was a bit bigger, but not much. In fact, in a few years, the intermediates would be about the same size as the Savoy anyway. In fact, in terms of wheelbase, some would be longer. So I think the reason they didn't do this is probably because they knew they had their own intermediate on the way, as well as some new engines. So they just sort of held their course and didn't really respond to the threat from the G.T.O in 1964. Still, the Savoy and its twins, while not exactly muscle cars, are really close. And a Savoy with a 426 and a 4-speed was one of the quickest street cars you could buy. Also, if it got it with an automatic, it had a 3-speed, so that was an advantage over the General Motors muscle cars. That said, 426 Savoy was very rare. Few people selected that engine option. Let's talk about muscle car performance in 1964. There are quite a few muscle car myths out there. First of all, people think they were heavy. They were not. At 3,500 pounds, a 64 G.T.O is lighter than a 2019 Toyota Camry V6. People also think that muscle cars had terrible handling compared with other cars from the era. That's not really true. But there are 3 factors that perpetuate that myth. First of all, people often mix up the regular car, for example, the 68 Charger, with the muscle car version, the Charger RT. The regular car did have terrible handling. Second, most muscle cars had bias ply tires. Those were downright scary. When equipped with radial tires, they handled just as well as the bigger European sedans, most of which were coming out with radial tires by this point. Finally, if you're comparing them to modern cars, then of course they don't handle well, but compared with other cars from the 60s, they were pretty good, especially when compared with other cars of similar size and bulk. Lastly, muscle cars are not as fast as people seem to think. I hear all the time about how muscle cars ran 12s in the quarter mile. They didn't. The vast majority of muscle cars ran in the 14s and 15s. Now, there were some cars that could run 12s. For example, a 427 Cobra or a 427 Corvette could do it, but I don't really consider those muscle cars. There were some tuner cars like the Hurst Olds that were extra quick and in the 13s. Plus, there were some ultra-rare option combinations. For example, a 69 Roadrunner, if you got it with a 440 pack 410 gears, put slicks on it, it could maybe nudge into the very high 12s, but that car would be useless on the highway with those gears. For the most part, this series is going to focus on these cars as they actually ran in the most common configurations. Here's the complication with comparing muscle car quarter mile times, or one of the complications. And that is the specific option combination has a greater effect on the quarter mile times than the two cars in comparison, largely because of the variations in transmission and rear axle ratio choices. For example, if we option our 64 Chevelle with a 300 horsepower 327 4-speed and a 336 posi-traction rear end, we can easily drag race and beat a 64 G.T.O with a 325 horse 389 2-speed automatic and 308 rear end. Of course, that's not really a valid comparison, as a G.T.O buyer concerned about drag racing performance would not have ordered the car that way. But I think you get my point. The options mattered a lot, and I assure you there were Chevelles that were in that configuration. So, with all that taken into consideration, let's look at the quarter mile times for various cars from 1964, Note I used 1965 test data for the Mustang. All these tests are from various magazines, and they're all tests that are in harmony with other tests and I think are quite reasonable. As we can see, the G.T.O is the quickest car here, although if we look at the gear ratios, we can see a bit more of the story. For example, the Mustang GT is abnormally quick for a Mustang due to the optional 3.89 to 1 rear axle ratio. That means the drive shaft spins around 3.89 times for every 1 time the wheels spin around. This is a great ratio for acceleration, but it's terrible for cruising on the highway, top speed, or fuel economy. That car is going to drink fuel like there's no tomorrow and wear out prematurely. A typical 289, 271 horsepower Mustang would have been in the mid-16s with the more common rear axle ratios. With the Sport Fury, we have the opposite condition. This car is geared for super comfy highway cruising and incredible top speed, yet it's still really fast in the quarter mile, which shows just how much potential Plymouth was sitting on here. This is one of the big variables that I was talking about earlier. As an example, the G.T.O could be ordered with 7 different axle ratios, 2 of which were dealer installed. These were the 308, 323, 336, 355, and 390. If the close ratio 4-speed transmission was selected, you could get 410 or even 433. Let's look at the effect these would have on top speed and other factors. At the engine's red line of 5,200 RPM in top gear, these are the maximum speeds for each axle ratio in the G.T.O. So you can see that those numerically high gears, 3.9 to 1, just aren't that great in the real world. Oh, and did you want air conditioning? Because if you do, the 3.08 and 3.23 axle ratios are your only choices. With the 3.9 axle ratio, you would be at 3,500 RPM at 70 miles per hour in 4th gear. That's a lot when your red line is 5,200. It's also a lot of extra RPM on your air conditioning compressor. Fuel economy, the extra wear and tear are going to take a big chunk out of your wallet. The 411 and 433 gears were dealer installed and would probably have been combined with hotter cams and higher red lines for customers intent on spending a lot of time at the local drag strip. It was possible with certain dealer upgrades to squeak a G.T.O into the 13s, but a typical 64 G.T.O ran a 15-second quarter mile with 323 gears, which actually is really quick. Of course, tires were terrible back then, and modern tires would shave quite a bit off those times, I'll bet half a second. In part 2, we're going to start into the 1965 model year, and we'll be going into a lot more specifics about each car. In this episode, I had to cover a lot of general topics like gross horsepower versus net and gear ratios. I'm going to focus in this series on cars that fit the most strict definition of muscle car. I do know that there are a lot of other great cars that were made in the 60s, like the big block Impalas, Grand Prix, Galaxies, Rivieras. I'll be saving those for a different series, just like I will the pony cars. Please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.